One of the reasons to play tabletop role-playing games is the presence of magic. Being able to wield supernatural power, cast terrifying spells, and summon sorcerous aid is one of the main reasons so many of us choose to play wizards, sorcerers, druids, and kind of other similar characters. So why are they so often kind of boring? Stick around and we'll talk about why. Hi everyone, I'm Garrett, and today we are going to talk about magic in our tabletop role-playing games. Specifically, we're going to discuss the way magic-using characters generally play in heroic fantasy systems. Now, I'm just going to lay my cards on the table right now and say that I think the way 5e that does magic is really bland. I don't think it's interesting or engaging at all, and if it is, it's probably for all the wrong reasons. Now, usually when I state such a forceful opinion, I have to wear my ring of protection as people flood into the comments, tell me how wrong I am, how I'm a terrible game master, how I've blackened the hobby by stating my opinion, how they wish I lived in a cave with no basic amenities, all that kind of stuff. I mean, that's actually okay, to be honest. I don't mind people disagreeing with me, but I ask that you hear me out on this one. Now, I'm going to lay out my issues with how I think magic is generally presented mechanically, and then a few things that I think would go some measure to making it more interesting. To understand why I think 5e gets this so wrong, we have to look at that system, where it comes from, and what I think it's trying to achieve and why it sort of fails to do that. In doing that, we can start to unpick it a little bit. In 5e, characters prepare spells and then are able to cast them using spell slots, which are a resource that every magic-using character has. Every time a character casts a spell, they must spend one of these spell slots of the appropriate level for the spell. There are a couple of spells, namely cantrips, which can be cast an unlimited number of times each day. This process of memorizing and preparing spells, which are then spent, is sometimes called the Vancian magic system. Now, I fully understand that Vancian can mean slightly different things depending on who you speak to, but here I'm using it to mean that to cast a spell, a character in the game world must prepare it beforehand to a greater or lesser, kind of specificity, and then when it is cast, it sort of leaves the character spent. This mechanical heritage gets its name from Jack Vance, an American author of science fiction and fantasy, whose wizards generally used a similar system to the one I've just described. Vance is probably my all-time favourite author, and his Leoness trilogy remains my most kind of cherished fantasy series. In his Dying Earth cycle, we can see his version of the Vancian magic system most clearly. The Dying Earth cycle is a collection of short stories followed by a set of novels. In one of those opening short stories, the wizard Vancian prepares his spells in the Vancian way. Now, to be honest with you, I wouldn't normally do this, but I'm actually going to read the passage to you because I think it evokes the strangeness and the mystery that we actually want for our magic systems, and that many magic systems in tabletop role-playing, especially now, like in today's world, totally fail to evoke. So this is the extract. Vancian made a selection from his books, and with great effort forced 5 spells upon his brain. Fandal's Gyrator, Velagen's second hypnotic spell, the excellent prismatic spray, the charm of untiring nourishment, and the spell of the omnipotent sphere. This accomplished, Vancian drank wine and retired to his couch. I mean, that's just great, right? It's super weird and mysterious. I like the idea that Vancian, who was actually the villain in that piece, has to force the spells into his brain. That tiny word choice makes me start to consider spells as sort of living entities that spellcasters learn how to kind of imprison in their brain until they're called upon. Reminds me of Terry Pratchett's Discworld book, especially The Colour of Magic, the very first one. Now, we can also appreciate that earlier versions of D&D hewed even closer to this kind of formula, with characters not having spell slots per se, but instead having to name the exact spells they were memorizing for the day. Now, before we go any further, I want to go out and say that I think this is a great system, and I've run many campaigns like this. Usually players just hand me a kind of post-it note or DM me if we're playing online with what spells they've prepared for the day. But this, while it can be a bit of an onerous bookkeeping job at the table, isn't the issue with the issue I have with how magic is presented in 5e. I have 2 main issues which I'll lay out now. It's too accessible and it's too predictable. Firstly, let's talk about how accessible magic is. What I mean by this is that by default, magic is basically everywhere. It's ubiquitous. Every peasant and his grandma can seemingly cast spells, especially in the Forgotten Realms, the default setting. I thought that magic was supposed to be secret, otherworldly, and maybe even a bit dangerous. That's how I like it to be in my games, at least. What's the point, though, if like every other fella can kind of cast Mage Hand to do the washing up for him, or throw a fireball or acid splash whenever he pleases? I suppose this sort of comes back to the old issue of why do people in these settings become adventurers? Surely, if it's as easy as that to summon otherworldly forces to do your bidding, then like every old farmer with a slightly sharp shovel would be plundering tombs for literal heaps of gold. But I appreciate that's me getting off topic from Magic. It's not even that Magic seems totally ubiquitous in the worlds of modern D&D that is the main issue. It's the fact that pretty much every single class has the option to become a spellcaster. It debases it, it devalues it. It becomes this highly mechanized tool that can be invoked by not just the wizard, but the artificer, the rogue, and even the fighter if certain kind of character choices are taken. Thin gruel fantasy with no real distinction or anything that makes Magic seem special. The thing is, Magic in D&D sort of slithers into the game from pulp fantasy stories. Characters like Conan the Barbarian that Gary Gygax had read before starting to work on D&D in the mid-70s. In these stories, by the way, magicians are almost uniformly villains and magic is a dangerous and corrupting force. I think the idea of cantrips, that is, spells that can be cast an unlimited number of times without any sort of cost or risk, really undermines this sense of mystery and wonder by presenting magic as incredibly easy to evoke. I always wonder why a first level fighter would be a first level fighter when their friend can like throw a bolt of like magical fire for much the same amount of damage and like for the same level of difficulty. Dragonlance, one of D&D's earlier settings, had magicians complete a grueling and often disfiguring examination known as the test to be able to cast high-level spells. I can understand why then, logically, in that fictional world, why not everyone is a magician, because it's so dangerous and difficult to become so. Now, the other issue with Magic, as I've stated, is that it's incredibly predictable, like yawningly predictable. And what I mean by that is that spells work exactly the same way every single time that they are invoked. Every time a character casts Magic Missile, that spell works the exact same way. It doesn't matter who is casting it or the conditions under which it's being cast. Sometimes, I see people online suggest things like having players reskin their spells descriptively to their specific characters, but I find this sort of just doesn't really do anything meaningful in the game, especially if it's not supported by any amount of mechanical differentiation. It's frustrating to suggest, I think, that this mercurial force, which is to say magic, works almost like a computer program, like input in, input out. A caster just has to speak a certain way, and the spell produces the exact same effect that it did last time and the time before that. I never got why magicians don't have to roll to cast, but a fighter has to roll a d20 to hit an enemy, like with his sword. I think having magic be unpredictable can lend a certain amount of tension and excitement to the game. I go on record to say that I think Wild Magic, the Wild Magic table for when the Sorcerer miscasts, is probably the most interesting part of any class feature in 5e. Everyone wants to know what will happen when that Sorcerer miscasts. To add to that, I never understood why spells like Fireball hit precisely their target every time. I can't be the only game master who's had players like frustratingly trying to align their Fireball so it just perfectly hits the enemy and none of their friends. Surely a sort of to-hit roll should be required, I think, with a failure resulting in the Fireball scattering off randomly in a different direction. It makes the spell more exciting and reactive instead of this sort of dry exercise in square counting on the battle mat. There should always be the possibility that magic gets out of control. Now, as I've said, I'm talking about D&D here. Not every game has magic like this. Dungeon Crawl Classics, for example, by Goodman Games, has probably the most interesting spell system that I've seen, while hewing still fairly close to the sort of D&D formula. It's not totally wild. In DCC, that is Dungeon Crawl Classics, wizards roll a dice to cast their spell and then check their outcome against a table for that specific spell. Sometimes it'll fizzle out or miscast. Other times it'll be far more explosive than the caster intended or even really desired. Again, unpredictability can help build a sense of tension, help build a sense of excitement and interest and mystery. In DCC, wizards can cast a spell an unlimited number of times, but each time they risk a miscast or forgetting the spell or worse. It shifts the paradigm for the players, not the characters, for the players from, I suppose for the characters as well, from resource management, I have this number of spell slots, until I have to rest, to risk management. I could really benefit from casting this spell right now, but if it goes wrong, it's going to land the party in an even more precarious situation than they're already in. Now, let's be honest, Counterspell is boring in 5 years written. It always feels like a gotcha moment whenever the party or the game master uses it to just cancel an effect. I found that players spend silly amounts of time trying to circumvent the issue of counterspell whenever they know they're going to face multiple wizards at once. DCC has wizards engage in protracted battles of will over whose sorcerous power and whose control of magic is kind of mightier. And while both resource and risk management, do have their places in heroic fantasy, both of them do, I'd always lean in favor of risk management mechanics when it comes to mysterious and supernatural forces like magic. In my own game, Journeyman Expert Master, I pretty much hew between the two, to be honest. Player characters have FP, all of them do. That's fatigue points. They can be used on special abilities like turning undead, performing power attacks if you're a fighter, and of course, casting spells. But then spells also have different outcomes depending on whether the caster critically fails, succeeds, or critically succeeds their kind of spellcasting test. For me, this has struck a balance between the two aforementioned ways of doing magic without allowing magic to become incredibly predictable, which here is really just a byword for boring. Similarly, many spells like Fireball do actually require sort of to hit roll unless the caster critically succeeds their spellcasting test. High level casters are often able to take talents that reduce the amount of FP required to cast a spell and may be able to spend more to alter the spell's outcome with kind of sorcery. If you're interested in knowing a bit more about that, then there's a free version of the game below, which gets you the vast majority of the spells and a few of the classes, to kind of try them out with. I think pulling the use of magic back in the direction of the mysterious and the unknowable, making it a little less predictable and a bit riskier, would go a long way to addressing some of the issues that I think D&D currently has in terms of its disparity between spellcasters and martial-type characters. Right now, it seems that issue is largely addressed by just giving fighters way more hit points and more attacks than is necessary without really solving the problem. It also makes spells boring, right? And we want to make it interesting. But anyway, that's what I think. I'm happy for you to disagree. What do you think? Do you love the way 5e handles magic? Do you hate it? Come across a system that you think is superior or worse? Let me know in the comments below. Now, as ever, thank you for taking the time to listen to this. Like and subscribe, do all that good stuff. I'm Gary, and I'll speak with you again soon.